Hey gang, thanks for coming. It's our first meet up in a couple of months. We had a break in August because of UX Australia. Thank you very much for coming. We've got a terrific topic and speaker tonight. I'll introduce him in just a second, but first I want to run through some of the news and events and things that are happening in our meetup world. There is a rumour, a suspicion, a rumour that one of our colleagues down front here might be speaking next month. I can't confirm or deny that, but I won't even mention his name. Hopefully you can figure out who that is. And I just wanted to make a special note of OzChi. There's a few OzChi representatives in the room. Sonia, Florian, and I think there's other sort of hanger-oners around the place as well. That's the 5th to the 7th of December at the... Florian, why don't you introduce it?
Yes, so last thing I heard is that it's at the State Library this year. And yeah, so OzChi is a good place for academia and industry to come together. And we're running some industry days for a couple of days there on a Tuesday and on a Wednesday. And yeah, so if you're interested, come along on the Tuesday for a free symposium or for the meetup at night. And on the Wednesday, if you're interested in presenting, go on the OzChi website and you just have to submit like a short abstract to the topic and
Sounds great.
Industry presentation.
And there will be also a panel. So there are different things happening, but we're also looking into inputting and shaping the days on industries. So
Brilliant.
if you're interested, hang around.
So we've got meetup at. So in theory, this meetup is going to be held at OzChi or thereabouts in December during that time period.
Excellent.
What we'll present on or what we'll talk about or what's going to happen is this. But we may be there. We hope to be there. And next month, the great man. No pressure.
Are you going to fly drones around the room?
Okay. But to get through to you, sir, nameless. First of all, we have to get past Tilman Dingler, who's presenting tonight's session, and he has quite a list of achievements on his profile here. I just want to read through a bit of Tilman's background for everyone. Tilman was educated at the University of San Francisco and the Center for Digital Technology and Management. Where is that?
Munich.
Munich.
Yeah.
And the University of Stuttgart. You were at the Georgia Institute of Technology. You were at the University of California, Berkeley. You were at the University of Glasgow. You were at Yahoo for a while, but that was apparently boring.
So this guy just can't hold down a job.
You don't know why. So Yahoo couldn't deal with him. Tinyco couldn't deal with him. Telefonica, back at Stuttgart again. Then you were in Japan for a while at Osaka Prefecture University, MIT Media Lab, and finally, after all of that, journeying around the world, he landed up at University of Melbourne as a research fellow in human-computer interaction. And one of the key topics of his research and work is, of course, cognition-aware technologies and what was that other term that I forgot to mention? Cognitive bias. Yeah, and so Tilman's going to talk to us about some of the research and the work that he's doing in that field tonight. It's going to be fascinating because I've seen him and his colleagues speak about their topics, and I just wanted to make mention of Eduardo, who came down 6 months ago and gave us that great talk on building gaze-aware systems, and that was fantastic. So thank you to Eduardo, and congratulations, and welcome, please, Tilman to the floor.
Sound like an ADHD kid. When I was born, there was Ritalin wasn't a thing yet, so.
Good luck.
Thank you. There's really two themes that you'll see throughout this talk, or behind the reason why this is a bit of a jumpy curriculum. One is research and the other one is kitesurfing. So, and I try to combine the both of them, sometimes a bit more successful than other times. This is a bit of a it's different. It's more of a private talk, but also we'll go a bit into geopolitical realms at the end of this talk, and it's a bit different than the usual academic filter bubble talks that I give, as you can see, because I added pictures and colors, and probably lost the audience of designers already. But I want to start with this a little bit by asking you a couple of questions, just to set the mood a bit. And I want you to kind of think for a second, when was the last time, and shout it out, that you listened to a song or musical piece?
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Without fiddling with a book, phone, or being engaged in some kind of conversation. Anyone? Yeah.
Can you say conversation with a chatbot? No.
That will be my kind of
That is
conversation.
very sad.
I often tell Alexa to play something for me.
But then do
Yeah,
you
but then
keep
you
talking
listen
to her?
up. Yeah, do you keep chatting with it? What do you think of the music?
No, she doesn't answer.
She never answers.
Do you do that at work?
Oh, she's playing hard to get.
So we have a few, that's great. Next one would be, when was the last time when you were reading a book or article?
This morning. Yes.
30 minutes, uninterrupted.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Nice. All right,
Love books.
couple of people. And then when was the last time that you decided to let your mind wander for 5 minutes?
1970.
Were you born? No.
Certainly. While you're waiting for, in some kind of waiting situation. And I bring this up because we have these kind of waiting situations in a tram stop, in a shopping line, and so on. And a lot of times you'll do what I do, and other people probably around you. You'll take out your phone instead of engaging in any of these activities and kind of like tweet away or like read or check your latest Facebook feed and so on. And so that kind of problem is really at the core of observation, is at the core of this talk a little bit. And I can probably completely skip the next slide since I already did this spiel, but just to give you a little background. So I'm originally Bavarian. So I was educated in Munich. Unterfranke.
The two Bavarians.
So I did my thesis I wrote in Glasgow, Scotland, on auditory interfaces. And I noticed that after a year that it's a sunny day there, it only rains from the top. And so after I finished my thesis, I packed my things and moved to California, where I was kind of engaged in a master's degree in web science, but then I started pretty much immediately working for Yahoo, who then went through this interesting tumultuous time. I survived 4 or 5 CEOs at the time. The direction was kind of unclear and very exciting, and eventually I moved to, actually it was between a different company, my startup, until my later supervisor, and came to California and said, hey, didn't you start this academic track at some point, and why don't you come back? And after 3 years in the US, I was fed up with all of it, and I said, okay, fine, let's move back to Europe. And so I joined the HCI group in Stuttgart, working on cognition-aware systems. It's a special type of context-aware systems, and we'll go more in depth into that. And then after that, with a little stop in Cape Town, I moved to Japan, where I spent the major part of a year fiddling with all kinds of bureaucratic barriers before actually signing a contract here. So signing a contract here. And while I was kind of like waiting, because the Australian government is quite suspicious when someone has been traveling so much, so in the end I had to provide like 3 or 4 police clearance certificates. That's fun, especially when you live in Japan, trying to explain an officer that you want to move to Australia, but you're from Germany, but you need fingerprints taken in Japan to send it to the FBI in the US. So that took a while, 4 to 5 months, which we spent in Boston, and I'll go into what we actually did there. So this talk, as I mentioned, is about our technologies and how they affect us, and it's a bit grim, and some of it is hopefully a bit optimistic, but basically is this notion of the truth is that they have detrimental effects on our physical health, on our mental health, and well-being, and such. And so there's this basically a lot of research that shows now that research has just starting to catch up with what these, the proliferance of all these information technologies are doing to us. So right now we have 2.5 billion devices spread around the world. People are using it on a daily basis, and it does affect us in major ways. 50% of you use their cell phones in the middle of the night, research has shown, and especially before going to bed. And this has been shown to be highly correlated with, or inversely correlated with your sleep quality, with the amount of sleep that you get. And sleep is really at the root of all evils in a sense, because it has then effects on your mental health, such as your motivation, attention, and also your physical health, such as cardiovascular conditions and anxiety and stuff. And if that's not enough, it affects our relationships as well. So another group of researchers have shown that the mere fact that the phone is in the room, in the periphery of your visual attention, affects how you interact and how deeply you engage with your conversation partner, and not to the benefit of it. And then there's this notion of how we kind of offload a lot of our cognitive skills to the phone, right? And researchers have shown that instead of trying to remember facts, remembering your phone number, like going through these routines of asking yourself questions, digging for questions, it's much easier to just go into your pocket, pull out Google, and go straight to the answer. And what happens with that is if we do this repeatedly, we actually neglect our cognitive abilities, thereby causing them to slowly but certainly to deteriorate, which is not the best thing. And at the core of it really is this these constant attention shifts, right? It's like we have we live two parallel lives. One is in the digital world. In the real world, you're sitting here. The other one is really the one that is accessible through your pocket, through your glasses, through your watch, and so on. And it's what I call the kind of digital schizophrenia, right? I mean, these are two different personas, or multiple personas a lot of the times. But there is this divide, and we've seen over the years how this word moves closer and closer together, in a sense. But on the other hand, it also causes us to constantly, even though the gap is getting smaller, to constantly jump between the two. And the first time I personally realized that very profoundly was when I was in Barcelona, working with Telefonica R&D, and we looked at how attentive people are towards their phones. And this is really, the attentiveness is defined kind of like as the moment you get a mobile message to your phone, in form of a notification, and how quickly you react to that, and how quickly we can expect you to react to that. So the idea was really, if I send you a message, how quickly can I assume that you will get to that message and either respond, ignore, or dismiss it. All right? And so we collected, there was a study, we collected a bunch of, over a period of a couple of weeks, notifications, and looked at how quickly people actually did this. And you can see how pretty much throughout the entire day there's a constant, really high attentiveness. And attentiveness in that sense was really that the likelihood of you attending to an incoming message within 2.08 minutes was 75%. And over the weekends, we saw a little decline, but it was constantly high throughout the week, resulting in an attentive state of more than 12.1 hours per day. And that's out of your waking hours, right? Which accumulates to 84 hours per week. So within that time, people just are very close to their phones, and we know this. It's kind of like this research on, it's just an arm's reach away most of the time, and it's really profound how how much attention we pay to this. And one of the conclusions here also was, even if people were in a sense not attentive to their phones, there was a high chance that within the next 5 minutes they would return to that state. All right. So, and that really, Telefonica and also in Stuttgart made us start thinking about, well, can we rethink this in some ways? You know, the smartphone really is like the newer version of the monocle. You come across something and you kind of you fidget around with in your pockets, you take it out in order to take a closer look. And so on average, I think it was Starner who said that, or found that 20 seconds it takes you to kind of like do this interaction, right? Like, oh, the vibration, take it out, have to unlock it, or maybe have to pin, maybe have a fingerprint, whatever. But until I get to the notification, therefore to the application, it takes 20 seconds, right? And then Larry Page of Google, he kind of like said, okay, if we can only bring this number down, that's when we can really truly have a seamless experience with that. And that's Starner, who I also already mentioned, who is a professor at Georgia Tech, but also the lead engineer or lead researcher on the Google Gas project. He basically summarized this, that when the time between intention and action becomes small enough, the interface becomes an extension of the self. And that's a really interesting notion, right? Because right now we're distracted by these phones. We kind of use them as a tool. But what if they could actually be a more, like a sixth sense, like a part of our bodies? And of course, you know, there's been a lot of commercial ventures that went into this field, you know, wearable computing, eyewear computing, more or less, sometimes some more than others are successful. This is the newest kind of gadget, the Magic Leap, right? Which is a mixed reality headset, kind of like augmenting your visual field while taking into consideration the geometry of the room and the location and so on. And of course, as academics, we're really excited about these things. So we get those devices, we do studies, and so I had my fair share of this, looking into how people read on smartphones, using eye tracking, using different types of reading interfaces. In this case, you see this. It's called like rapid serial visual presentation. It's basically what a couple of years ago was a big hype on when you have like in one spot you have one word, and then instead of like reading from left to right or down, depending where you're from, the words appear in one spot and kind of like rattle through. And for devices that are really limited in screen real estate, that's a really effective technique. We then ported that to head-mounted displays, and so how did people kind of like, without taking out their phone, kind of walk through their daily life and still being able to kind of catch up with their digital self and so on. So these are kind of like the things that we're moving into. You know, the interfaces become more closer to our body. You know, they become ingrained in our body parts and so on. But on the other hand, we still have this kind of dichotomy of you know, still need to check, or still need to kind of pay attention to, or drawn towards the attention from a different realm in a sense. So the next step then really is to kind of like rethink those applications. And one of the pioneers of VR, basically, he focuses a lot on how advertisers, marketeers abuse really this economy, the attention economy, right? And it's not only them. I mean, it's the whole system that they kind of created, in the sense that there's monetary value in having people's attention and keeping their attention. And I think in the last couple of years we've seen that might not be a good idea. I mean, one of the consequences is the physical and mental consequences that this has. But the other one is that there's really no end in sight, because the incentives are set in the wrong way, right? I mean, Google, Facebook, and all these platforms, they make more money, but the longer they can keep you. And generally, you just published a book, like 10 arguments why you should get off your social media accounts and so on. It's definitely worth a read. And this was also a notion that kept us busy at Telefonica thinking about, well, the attention economy kind of like implies that everyone competes for your attention. But if you really look at how people like spend their time, these moments of idle being, like in a waiting situation and so on, they actively seek sometimes stimulation, right? We take out these phones not only because they buzz, but actually because we kind of drawn towards checking into that other self of ours. And this brought us to this notion of why is that, and we kind of like focused on what then became the boredom project, which like, can we detect those moments when people actually take out their phone with no specific goal in mind, just to kill some time. Right? So we launched a study where we literally asked people through an app a couple times a day, just like, hey, how bored are you right now? Rate yourself from 1 to 5. And it was like, a little bored, oh God, I'm really bored right now. And then we collected all this beautiful data, which we draw from the sensors that you have on your cell phone, in your pockets, such as app usage, battery drainage, Wi-Fi strength, how much cell tower activity, data activity, and all these things. And from that, we created a model to predict those states when people are bored. So basically, trained based on the ground truth of self-assessed boredom, a machine learning model that would then say, oh, I think you have a 75% chance right now to be bored. And that worked actually in up to 30% of the cases. And because these moments of actively turning towards the cell phone were highly correlated with the recency of communication, apps that people were using, the phase of the day matters, as we've seen already with the attentiveness. Demographics, different age, different gender groups actually do use their phone differently, and the intensity and type of phone usage and so on. And from that, we this model we incorporated into a reading app to see whether, hey, if before people actually go to that point of taking out their phone to actively stimulate, what if we can predict it and offer them some content, some random content, BuzzFeed at the time. And so basically, once in a while, a notification would pop up asking you, hey, here's an article, are you interested in reading this? And of course, it was either triggered by the algorithm that says, I think this is a bored state, or it was a random moment in order to compare the two of them. And then we found that people are more likely to click on bored states on the content when they were actually in a bored state. And for the statistics, enthusiasts in the room, this is actually really large effect size, because in 20.5% of the time when we triggered this app, the notification, when people were predicted to be bored, they actually interacted with the content, where every other advertiser would just randomly spam a person and at best get an 8% rate. And then we also measure how deeply people engage with the content, rather than just like opening it up and dismissing it. We looked at, do they engage with it for at least 30 seconds, and also there's quite a large effect on whether they were predicted to be bored and whether they actually interacted with the content in depth. And then the shitstorm started. When we published the study, all kinds of blogs were writing like, oh, Telefonica, these researchers from Germany, they're using your cell phone to track your boredom, to look into your mind, to destroy those moments that we cherish as mind-wandering moments and so on. And I was like, okay, fair. I'll get to it in a minute, but how we then twisted that a little bit to make it more useful in the sense. But Telefonica actually was really excited about it, and you can find parts of the algorithm now actually in an API that they released last year. So this is a product that they brought out, which is based on this prediction, which any advertiser, any app developer can use in order to make sense of what is going on in the context of the person, in order to a bit more smartly schedule their notifications, right? And so, kind of like what we promised after that whole thing, you're stealing our quiet time, instead of pointing people to nonsense content, such as boredom, we thought about it, hey, what if we can actually predict when there's a bit of time to engage people with learning content. So there's this notion of micro-learning, which are really small interactions with learning content, such as vocabulary, foreign language vocabulary, that you need to revisit in a certain frequency. And I think you've all seen the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which is pretty grim. The moment I tell you something, you're fine, 20 seconds, you also know it, in 3 minutes, 66% of that will be gone. In 3 days, it will be even worse. In a week's time, it's only going to be a 10 or 9% amount of that retained in your memory. So microlearning really is something to use to kind of bring that back on a regular basis and help people to transfer that knowledge into the long-term memory. And so this was an app then that scheduled these kind of tasks for, I think, 16 different, 8 different languages, and it would fire the notification, say, hey, it's time to revisit your vocabulary and so on. And instead of being mindlessly triggered, this was actually triggered by a predicted state of boredom, as an opportune moment for language learning. And we realized it might not be the same, right? I mean, people who might be bored don't want to necessarily engage with a cognitively demanding activity, right? So this was the kind of trial out. And in order to support this notion of microlearning, we built it into the notification drawer. So you could do all your vocabulary review actually in the notification drawer, which kind of looked like this. Notification comes in. This was the flashcard version. So basically it asks you, hey, transfer this, and then it kind of flips around. And you could say, oh, I knew that, or I didn't know, and then it goes back into your flashcard registry. So what we found, it didn't work. Moments of predicted boredom are not very, a little bit, but not very much correlated with the actual moments when people are willing to review learning content, right? And it could be because of that notion of, if I just want to doodle around with my phone, I don't want to have to deal with a demanding task, right? And so we had to train the remodel for this specific use case, and then we started experimenting with much more individual models. That basically we start with a general model that is kind of like 70% accurate, and then the more vocabulary was actually rehearsed, the more ground truth we collect, the more sensors we get, and the more we train the model on the phone of the people right now. So this is kind of this notion of in situ cognitive assessment. So it was this, in that moment, how likely is that this person is in a cognitive state where they want to engage with content, where they are receptive, where they are maybe also fatigued and should be left alone, or where they are in situations where it's just not appropriate to do this kind of interventions. And this we've since expanded this kind of like idea of in situ cognitive assessments. One of the things for all of you who didn't come to Eduardo's talk a couple of weeks ago, just really quick, one of the studies that we did, we used thermal cameras to kind of like get an idea of how is that person engaged in that very moment, when they're watching the video, when they're reading an article, or when they're just doing different tasks with different cognitive complexity. And one of the things that we found really was that the nose temperature and the stern temperature are really significant points to keep track of. As you start concentrating harder, it seems that your capillaries open up, your blood flow goes into your brain, and your nose cools down. And you can see that. You can see that in the thermal camera. And now we're incorporating that into learning technologies, such as when people watch video lectures and so on, to see when are they very demanded, when are they frustrated, overloaded, and so on, and then give that feedback either back to the to the system that then suggests alternative routes or suggests a break, or even to the lecturer or whoever creates the content to say, oh, maybe we need to revisit this particular part because no one gets it, or it's just hard. Yeah. This is the stats behind it, basically. So we had this reading tasks, and you can see the nose, the forehead, and then this difference between those two, because the stern was actually heating up and the literally heating up, and the nose was cooling down. And so I presented this beginning of this year at the Vienna Lab to the group that I was with, at Petty Mass Fluid Interface Group, and there was this kid, Thomas, and he's like, so if you can use tasks to heat people's face up, can we use devices to cool them down again? So I thought it was a really interesting idea, and the color has been removed for theatric purposes. But you can see here that we experimented with a temperature sensor on the forehead in order to get more accurate, even without a, because the idea was that people would wear it in their glasses, and kind of like in situ assess when they were really demanded. And so we did a couple of studies where we exposed people to really stressful, really painful tasks. They had to subtract 17 from 1033 in steps of 17, and that and under a time pressure and so on, so they're really stressed, and so on. And we actually installed, you can see it here, there's a collar on this man's neck, and there's a device in the back that literally induces cool. So we're trying to cool people down, well, we're still kind of looking at it, but the social, I think the social anxiety that people get from wearing this device kind of counteracts the effect of stress relief that it's inducing, which was a problem for our study because the data was really noisy. So the next version of this, much less anxious, are glasses that literally cool down your temple. And yeah, this is ongoing work, so I can't really say anything of whether that's working or not yet, but we're excited, and especially with all the smart eyewear that's coming up. Yes?
I'm sorry, I might have missed it, but what's the perceived advantage of cooling down someone's temples?
Very good. Sorry. The hypothesis is when when the brain heats up because of the blood flow in stress times, what if we induce a perceived experience of coolness in order to make people relaxed? Does that work? Can we literally? Okay. So if you think of this sweet spot between boredom, completely non-engaged, and frustration, too hard, right? Somewhere in between there's this flow state, right? And as we increase the difficulty of the tasks, people get into that task, but they fall over the edge at some point, right? If it gets too hard, people either give up, or they're frustrated, or they just disengage. So the idea is, can we push people beyond their natural threshold and endure a really high demanding task longer than they naturally would, okay, by giving them the perception of being cooled down. Yeah? So application would be kind of like a flight, what do you say?
Pilot.
Yeah, not the pilot, but the guys who kind of, yes, the tower, yeah. They have lots of objects to keep track of, the spatial object, or moving object task, and it's really highly demanding at peak times. That's why they have to, the shifts are never longer than 2 hours, and they burn their personnel quite heavily because it's a very stressful situation. So the idea was, can we, the hypothesis is still standing. Okay, so these were the in situ cognitive assessments. Experimenting was fun in the sense that, yeah, sometimes people are receptive to these kind of interventions, sometimes they're not. And can we, based on the context that they're in, people, are they engaged with some app currently, can we then predict their cognitive state? And then we noticed that there are idiosyncratic patterns based on when we actually conduct these studies. And of course you say, duh, because in the morning, I can't do anything, I need 2 or 3 coffees before I wake up, and then I can actually perform on a decent level. We all know the kind of the post-lunch dip when we have a schnitzel in our tummy. All the blood goes down there, and there's probably not much hope for a productive afternoon if you do that. So we have these times during the day where we're highly alert. We can focus for a prolonged amount of time, and then there are times when nothing really works. You know, you're rereading the same passage over and over again. Eyelids fall, and so on. So basically, and this is what it looks like if you kind of like plot your performance, your cognitive performance on a time scale. It goes from 6 in the morning to 11 at night, roughly. And this is based on cortisol levels. The studies that were done in the 1920s. Roughly 4 hours into your waking day, that's when you hit the peak, right? And of course, this is kind of like shifted. I mean, our students would be probably more over here. In Japan, they would be even further. So that has a lot to do with the chronotype, like people would really get into their day very early or get into their performing hours rather late. But generally, it's roughly how it looks like. And then there's this dip after, it's called the post-lunch dip, but it's not necessarily related to digestion. But it does get affected by it negatively, and then it comes back up in the afternoon, and you have another peak right before you drift off. And so, people in cognitive psychology have looked at these rhythms and tried to understand how they work on an individual level. In order to kind of like help people deal with anxiety issues, they're getting better sleep, and so on. And classically, these studies are done either in a sleep lab where people have to spend like 6-7 days without the exposure to sunlight. If you want to know your personal circadian rhythm, that's probably a big investment to make. Or the other version is having protocols, sleep rate protocols, or literally having a diary that says, okay, I woke up today at this point, I had so many hours of sleep, today I feel really energized, today I feel less energized, but these tend to take very long time because there's so many confounding variables, such as on the weekend I drank a beer, a box of beers, that kind of like mixes up my schedule again, and so they're really tough to analyze. There's physiological markers such as melatonin onset and cortisol I already mentioned, but they're usually very uncomfortable to take. So either you have to literally sample your own saliva every couple of hours, or measure your core body temperature through a rectal sensor. It's not much fun. So people started experimenting with phone usage and how we can create models that run on the phones based on how we use technologies. Can we see how these rhythms play out? And just to give you a little bit of the bio background behind it, so there's two processes basically. One is the homeostatic process, and it literally only says the more time you spend awake, the more your sleep drive accumulates, the more sleep you get. And the other one are circadian differences, which literally are these peaks, ups and downs. And because if you only had this process, everyone would be standing out of bed and would be super performant the moment that you open your eyes. But the circadian process, actually, they counteract each other in that sense, that that one needs to kick in here first, so that you have those productive hours in the morning. And then also at night, they kind of converge, and that's why we get eventually bed ready. So these were the two processes that we were looking for in our data. And we did a couple of studies where basically we released a toolkit asking people to perform all kinds of different tasks. It's a reaction task. How quickly can people tap things? How quickly can they discern two competing stimuli? And how accurately can they track multiple objects on a screen? Right. So you have to kind of imagine that these are the targets, and then they all start being colored blue, start moving, and then you have to relocate the ones that were the target circles at the beginning. And so we found that people are apparently differently able to perform these tasks during the day, and it helped us calculate these models or train these models to then say, okay, this is your circadian rhythm. And of course, people don't necessarily want to do these kind of like tasks all the time. So we looked at what if we take gaming data, right? So games have an inherent features that are really closely tied to a spatial object moving around, or reaction times and so on. So we can literally we've shown that we can take this kind of like game data in order to see people's very individual performances systematically differ across time. Another one is typing behavior. Everyone types throughout the day, and your error rate as well as your speed of typing differs. And then a more recent one is where we use eye tracking to kind of like see how much people blink, how long the blink is, how big the eye pupils are, and so on, and then correlate that with those rhythms. Anyway, so it works for some tasks better than for others, but basically you always see this homeostatic line, and the circadian variations. I'm not going to worry with that. Why is this good? Once we know your circadian rhythm, we can actually schedule interventions much more effectively. And every one of you has their own already innate strategy to deal with this, right? So we get a coffee in the morning, we go for a walk maybe after lunch, and so on. But usually we get a coffee when it's already too late, right? We're already down here. So what if your phone basically tells you in 20 minutes you're going to be here, so you better caffeinate up, right? Or you better take a walk. Walking is good because you're outside, sunlight, melatonin gets reduced through blue light, and you feel more refreshed. Also, task switches can pull you out of that tiredness or lethargy, if you will, right? Or you can take a nap, basically. So these are kind of interventions that we're now experimenting with based on these rhythms. Yes, but that problem kind of like still is there, right? So we have all these cool stuff we can do with cell phones, like learning, reading, and engaging, and communicating with each other. And then on the other hand, we have this inherently interruptive or disruptive technology. And so the first kind of like angle towards that is use the technology itself to redefine that one by bringing it closer to our bodies. The second was to change the applications to be a bit more smarter and more considerate about the cognitive states that people are in. And the third one is really to rethink the content that we're dealing with. And that's a work in progress, or these are things that we're thinking about right now. Well, you want to stay hashtag. And not every citation or quote you read on the web is genuine. That's why I also left out the quote in this slide. So one of the wonderful things that the internet has brought us, it has also brought us the current problem that we have with it, right? So in the 90s, when the Web 2.0 came out, and everyone was like, oh, now everyone can post, and everyone can put their voice out there, and this is going to lead to a democratization of information and so on. And we did see in 2010, in the wake of the Arab Spring, a lot of political shifts based on these developments that people could voice their concerns, their oppression, and so on. And now we've also seen the black backlash of that, right? And we've kind of like now at a point where we were thinking, I'm not so sure, Facebook still has this data, and how Zuckerberg had to come in front of the judiciary, Senate, had to come to the EU, kind of explain himself, what was happening to our data. And so all of a sudden, what seemed like a good thing, like a hopeful moment in time using these technologies, we're now experiencing this massive backlash, right? And a lot of it has to do with people kind of like being literally drawn into their own worlds. The phenomenon of filter bubbles or echo chambers, kind of like you're just surrounded by your own tribe. You hear the things and voices that you want to hear or that are familiar to you anyway, and that has led to things like the Brexit. We've had another backlash in the 2016 years. presidential election and so on. And one of the problems we see, and I think with the current discussion around the nomination of the highest judge, Brett Kavanaugh, is very much apparent that people have come, Democrats and Republicans have come so far apart that they lost kind of sight of the middle ground, right? So instead of having a reasonable discussion, it's kind of like this polarized scene where on the one side, people just think, I'm not going to consider your argument just because I know that you're corrupt in the first place. And that's a problem. And so the idea of that we're picking up again now is really, has been voiced a lot of times. And Ford famously said, if there's one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view, empathy, and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. And that accounts for all the voices across the spectrum of an argument. So in light of these trends, social media and news source, as a news source rising, the erosion of trust in traditional media that we see by having presidents lashing out against media, and in those filter bubbles where we're caught in our own little world, has led to things like polarization, segregation, and eventually hostility, right? And then from a psychological point of view, the things that are behind that is one is confirmation bias, right? It's much easier to listen to a voice that you're already familiar with, rather than consuming information that does not fit in your worldview and that gets repudiated. So one of the current studies we're setting up is really, can we detect those confirmation bias when people consume information? Can we detect whether they completely agree or completely repudiate that idea, or whatever it is that is expressed by the author or the producer of that content? So again, we were looking at biosignals, face temperatures, and also things like electrodermal activity, which is a stress indicator, people's heart rates, and so on. We expose them to different types of content, liberal, very conservative, all kinds of issues, being gun laws, abortion, renaming Australia, and all these kind of things where people usually have a very strong opinion. And then we see if we can actually build models that can show or can detect those biases and put a mirror in front of people and say, hey, did you actually know there's a lot of implicit bias in whatever it is that you're, how you're viewing the world, right? And this is then the first step, kind of self-awareness and reflection. The second step, you can imagine recommender systems to be opposed to what YouTube, for example, is doing right now. Oh, you like this video, so therefore I'm going to, recommend you down the rabbit hole. In a sense that I know that you like this, so therefore here's a more extreme version of this. Here's a more extreme version of this, and then all of a sudden you end up in some really weird place that you never thought you would see on the internet, right? But what if you actually have a recommender that does the inverse? It says, I think you're watching a lot of Colbert, so why not engage with some John Hannity for a change? So breaking people out of that hole is the goal. And then the last one is picking up Pascal's idea of my social anxiety when I talk to people and other situations where political issues are maybe not so easily discussed in families, friends, especially when it is about something that divides a country, such as the Catalan independence, Brexit, and so on. So maybe sometimes it's easier to just talk, let your steam off on the internet. So, but why not do it with an intelligent opponent that actually delivers you the facts or challenges your inherent assumptions? So the idea of the biased bot is literally you pick the topic, abortion, gun laws, whatever, and then it makes a statement such as, how much do you agree with the following statement? I think the right to bear firearms is indispensable to secure my personal safety and our freedom. Right? You say, yeah, I agree, or some would agree, no, I don't agree, and then it starts, right? So then the bot knows which side you're on, and then it takes the other side of the argument, and it starts kind of feeding you arguments that are pro or contra your beliefs. There's the other version of it, is the agreeable bot, which kind of takes your side and says, oh, isn't that great? And then it goes into the complete ridiculousness of the argumentation. And the goal, again, here is to kind of put a mirror in front of people and say, hey, did you know that there's a whole spectrum And of course, you know, there's some questions where this might not necessarily apply because there's no right or wrong, and sometimes there is a right or wrong, climate change. And so we're experimenting with these technologies and to kind of get back to the question of, can we not only rely, what if we cannot only rely on the technology itself or the content, but make people aware of their own biases and help them to develop these skills of critical thinking again. And that's the idea of critical media, really, which are systems that are intended to invite users to reflect on their views, acquire and advance media literacy and thinking skills, and subsequently contribute to a hopefully more informed public discourse. Why am I saying this? One final note of this is really, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And it's a notion that also Jared Lanier has in this book. When we think about information, we think, it's free and it should always be free. But that implies that there's an indefinite amount of information that I can consume, right? The problem with that is that if it's indefinite, my human experience is limited. I can only really make sense of information that I've received, that I've processed, that I've understood. And so therefore that information is only real in that sense if it contributes to my human experience. And my experience is by definition limited, because we only have so much time, we only have so much attention, as you can see, as you saw the graphs, so much cognitive capacity to process that. And so that notion of there's no such thing as free lunch, there's no such thing as free information, right? We need to rethink that notion, that especially in the times where everyone can tweet, everyone can put things on Twitter and Facebook and all these platforms. But what happens is it pushes out the reality of the serious issues. Right? And so if we're not careful and we think if information is free and it doesn't matter if I read this article really quick, these are resources that go into that, and therefore you're compromising on the other side. And this is really what cognition-aware technologies are about at the end of the day. Not only about bringing you closer to that technology and having it less interruptive and a bit more tailored towards your own biological clocks, but also help you rethink how you spend that time. Right. So in summary, to come back to the title that I was forced to to present today, we use this technology, or we hope that this technology will help transform the way that we interact with them by giving them awareness of our innate rhythms, schedules, biases, and so on. And from a UI design perspective, you know that we're working on APIs that let you literally query, from a scale from 0 to 100, how attentive is that person right now? And can I maybe adjust different version of my user interface to that person? Clutter it up if the person is close to boredom, or dumb it down if the person is close to being overloaded. Helping people just align their own schedules to it. Like if you think about your calendar and the tasks in there that probably need more cognitive capacities, like reading that article that has been sitting there on my desk for 2 months, versus I'll just go do my emails or go my laundry and so on. Right? So if you know where your productive times, you can schedule those times. And eventually, if we bring our body clock in rhythm with our schedules and so on, we're actually literally improving sleep and preventing things like stress and anxiety. You've got a bit more of self-awareness, and hopefully also, don't forget the off switch that luckily still exists in all of our technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Questions from the floor? Yes.
In your earlier stuff, earlier in the talk, I think, you didn't sort of differentiate between people who keep their phone switched to silent and people who don't. Is there any sort of difference there about the way we respond to things, or how much it means to us? Or
No, definitely. This was one, so the ringer status was one of the features that went into the model. And I mean, it's obvious that it's distracting or you catch people's attention more when there's an audio or a vibration that comes with it. And yeah, the model factors are one.
Yeah, so all of that stuff about interrupting my boredom or whatever isn't going to work if I have my thing on silent all the time. It requires me to be open to being interrupted.
Right, but the idea is literally, you know, you're at the bus stop, you pull out your phone, and the notification is sitting there waiting for you, as you would then normally go into your usual spiel. It actually says, hey, why don't you, call your mom?
Okay. So there is a difference between me pulling the phone out and the phone yelling at me.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we want to get rid of the yelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for a great presentation. Throughout the different projects, you were referring to we and people. Could you say a little bit about who are these people in terms of demographic and in particular age?
Okay, yeah, very good. So when I say we, it's usually the group of researchers or a group of collaborators we work with. So friends like Eduardo, working at University of Melbourne, or people in Stuttgart or at MIT. Usually we work with graduate or undergraduate researchers, but also with PhD students, postdocs. It's a mixed demographic in that sense. But I think what's more interesting is when you're getting at is the people who partake in the studies. Yeah? So a lot of that work, the large scale work where we actually deployed applications into an app store or such, we get a very wide variety of people. That is biased, obviously, by people who use their phone tend to find these apps somehow, right? Which is no way externally validated in terms of it reaches everyone on the planet, right? A lot of these initial models were recruiting people, especially from Spain and from Germany, since we had pools of participants from Telefonica and from the universities in Germany. What we do here, usually we have a list of people who like to participate in our user studies. Again, kind of like a self-selection bias in there. But sometimes, especially for the confirmation bias studies, I'm putting out literally printouts at community centers, churches, and so on, and trying to recruit people from more rural places by incentivizing to different compensation methods and so on. But yeah, it's definitely something we always think about. We also usually always report also the demographics of participants.
Your research sounds very interesting. This also has these Orwellian undertones. And it's a bit of a concern to me because humans or users are always a step behind the game. And the big organizations, Google, Facebook, everyone else, who are funding this research or being able to consume and monetize this research are miles ahead of us. And we don't even hear about these kind of data breaches or access or cognitive modeling of us until years after it's been implemented. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So how do we win that battle? How do we make us less prone to manipulation from organizations?
Yes. Very good question, something definitely up to debate. I think that there is a realization happening right now with that the big ones like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, and so on, that their market power has become overwhelming, mostly based on the data that we are all contributing. And it ties back to the notion of information is free in a sense. We live in an information age. So if everyone is an information worker and information is free, so therefore you're worthless. Right? But the ones that make or harvest the profit are the big companies right now. We've seen two changes which are interesting to kind of observe. One is the European Union has now reacted. They have put out these really strict privacy rules, the GDPR, about everyone should have the right for deletion. Everyone should have the right for transparency, which is much harder, right? All of a sudden, you can literally, you can write to any company that is based in Europe and say, I want to know how you're using my data. Which of your algorithms are informed by how I flick through my images on Facebook, for example, if the data center isn't done. So that's one way that the government or legislation kind of like catches up. But that's kind of like a problem because there are 3 or 4 generation gap in the ones that form that legislation. And I see, I'm hopeful in the sense that we're seeing things like the GDPR being implemented. There's another book that the German Green Party member put out, and he said, "Is data the new oil?" And he didn't refer to the cliche kind of like, oh, oil is valuable and so is your data, but he actually compares the oil industry to what we're seeing now, what's being done to our data, and the eventual breakup of the oil industry. So if you look back in the 50s, these industries, they became too powerful, too much money. They had their fingers in everything, in lobbying and everything. And the government stepped in and said, okay, enough of this, and we were breaking down hard on them. And that's, I think, the discussion also that scares a lot of those companies, that what if the government actually breaks down on these companies and says, okay, enough, we're going to split up Facebook, we're going to take it public, we're going to open source everything, and what's going to be next? Yeah. But I think the problem really is that there's this big disbalance between US or Western, West Coast of the US and the rest of the world, right? And so it's kind of like our obligation to kind of like find alternatives, to innovate and see how we can break that monopoly.
Great. Anyone else? Ask.
Yeah, I had to write it down. There's so much in it, but and I had to go back and find it. So I really like the idea of detecting states. It's fascinating. Like you detect people's so boredom, for instance. Has anybody sort of done any work on detecting someone's need for stimulus, like a smoke, and tried to think about how you can get an intervention in, and that sort of thing? Do you know if anything like that can be done?
Just what I know, there's this guy, Philipp Scholl, at the University of Freiburg, and he created a lighter that would log the times that you use it.
Oh.
And it was connected to your cell phone. The cell phone, again, you kind of like sense the context, time, but also are you outdoors, are you indoors, are you standing, are you sitting, and so on, and then tries to kind of like predict how frequently do you smoke, what are the occasions, are there people around, and so on. So I guess we can use, and this is a good thing about these kind of models, we can train them on all kinds of different situations, and then try to schedule interventions.
It's not only for evil.
No, no, absolutely.
Good uses there as well.
That's great.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I have two more announcements. One Florian already did. There is this OSCAI conference happening, and I think the industry paper track. If you want to be part of this, it's still open. So October 12th. You can literally submit your abstract and be part of the conference. And this is the URL, but you'll find it if you go to oskai.org. And another thing that we're now working on is getting SIGCHI here, which is a subset of the Association of Computing Machinery. So we already have CHI-SIG. Yeah, these are the ones that organize the OSCAI. However, they seem a bit dormant in a lot of aspects that SIGCHI might be able to cover, especially if you think about distinguished speaker programs. We can get people like Elizabeth Churchill, Engelbert Schmidt, Hans Gelassen to Australia, and you can see the big dark spot here in Australia. So we're trying to establish this, and if you want to talk about this, go for years after and talk about those cool events that we can hopefully do together with the meetup community. Kind of like really bridging that gap between, we're academics and it's 20 years out, and then here's these real world problems that we need to fix now, right? And that's the idea of this, to have maybe a 50-50 balance in that with issues that people can find a platform to discuss with.
Awesome.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks.
We will be going for beers at, where do we go? Hell's Kitchen. Just down in the laneway downstairs. So we'll see you there.
That's a lane.
Thanks, Tilman.